Okay, we are being recorded.
So thank you very much, Lothar, for agreeing to have a conversation with me. I think I wanted to focus today mostly on questions that have to do with mentorship and influences that have affected your scholarship and your route through life as a professional academic and archaeologist, particularly a Chinese archaeologist. It's actually wonderful. I just had the experience again to listen to parts of the conversation that you had with Juan Saucy just a year ago about the book of interviews that has been published with you. So there's a lot out there, of course, of your past and your experiences and your interests. But I'm not sure that I and certainly maybe other people who might end up watching this necessarily fully understand kind of the lived experience that you've had going through life as a young person interested in, who got increasingly interested in China and archaeology, and then throughout your educational and career as a professor. So I'd just love to hear more about that, and maybe just ask a few questions and see how you respond. So maybe we can start at the beginning and talk a little bit about what it was that first got you interested in China, first got you interested in archaeology. They may be very different things. For me, they were quite different things in terms of the origins of my interest in these two topics, and you know what the motivation was for those interests. So let's start there.
That's a very challenging question, and of course it forces one to try to remember periods that are very far away and reconstruct the thought processes that went on in one's mind at the time. And of course, there's nobody else around who can do it. And in my case, I may be misremembering. So this may be sort of a version that if at some point I do further research into my own past, I may have to revise. But essentially, I grew up in a provincial German town, which was rather closed to the world. It was fortunately after 1968, in the sense that it wasn't the stifling atmosphere of the 1950s, but it was already during the time when certain events in the German past that had been sort of swept under the table for 10 years had been had been sort of brought back to the surface and were being discussed. And certainly my generation, or at least the people I knew in my generation, were quite aware that there was something, fundamentally problematic about West Germany and its place in the world and its past. And there was a general sense that one had to be very much aware of the rest of the world and try to get out of this rather closed mind frame, which, to be fair, certainly my parents already had overcome. My father had spent time in the 1950s studying at Cornell Law School and then working in a New York law firm for 2 years. And so he was very much in a mindset that already had transcended narrow sort of German frameworks. And in that sense, he was somewhat different, I think, for most of the other people in his generation that we knew. And I also, of course, was in this way exposed to a world out there that was more complicated. So clearly, given the general unease about the immediate context and the awareness that there was a way of engaging with what was beyond there. The question came up, you know, what to do about it. And also the question is, what can I, in the situation in which, you know, fate has placed me, do about it? I started learning languages. That's something I was good at, and there were opportunities even in my hometown to go beyond what the schools were offering. And so I was bored in school, so I spent afternoons and evenings trying to find, you know, whatever interesting languages might be being taught at other institutions. And one of the things I stumbled across was a Chinese course taught at the local Center of Lifelong Learning, or a Youth Activities Center, I guess is what it would be called. And there was this very interesting recent emigre from mainland China who had managed to moved to Germany in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. I have no idea what the background of that was, who was completely steeped in the ideology of China at the time, and who was sort of teaching Chinese. That's how he was making a living at the time, teaching Chinese at Bochum University, which was next to my hometown. And of course, the students at the time who were studying Chinese were basically all steeped in Maoist ideology themselves. They thought that Cultural Revolution, China was just the most extraordinary thing. And he was not impressed with them because he thought that that these students were fundamentally bourgeois and that this was just a phase in their lives. And of course, he was totally correct. Nothing ever came of any of this. But anyway, he was then motivated to offer this Chinese course in a town in my hometown, Essen, which at that time didn't have a university, or maybe they had just started a university, but certainly no Chinese there, which was known as an industrial town. And maybe he thought that he would meet real proletarians there, who by learning Chinese could then sort of enter in some kind of a revolutionary communion with their counterparts in China. Well, instead he got me. I also had a classmate from high school who was also in this class, and I think he realized that wasn't what motivated us, but simply sort of interest in China and curiosity. It wasn't really much more than that at that point. And but he still very conscientiously taught us. And then he went away and the Chinese course stopped, but I had essentially been exposed to enough of that I knew that at least I wanted to find out more. I wasn't sure at all what to do with myself in the rest of my life. There was, since my father was a lawyer, there was a certain idea that probably that would be a good idea for me as well. I wasn't very good at technical skills, so that was out. I didn't have the kinds of motorical talents that one would need to be, for instance, a professional musician or an engineer, or medical practitioner. So that was sort of in the back of my mind. But when time came to enter university, I decided that the first thing I wanted to do was to learn Chinese properly and then see what to do next. So so that's what I did. I enrolled in sinology at Bonn University, still knowing practically nothing about China, and having little ambition as to what to specialize in, except for wanting to learn the language properly, and maybe then go to China and find out more. And so I spent time at university learning Chinese and otherwise learning things that basically interested me in a general way, like art history and history and philosophy and Italian literature and various other things. You know, when my schedule was insanely full, but it was all very inspiring. And then 2 years after that, after 2 years of that, I got a scholarship to spend time in China. And at that point, the question became, you know, what do I want to study when I'm in China? And there was a range of possible fields. And one of them was archaeology, which nobody had ever done before because it had just been opened. And somehow, I mean, I knew at that point enough about, I guess, Chinese studies to know that that would be really important. And there was something to be found out there that was genuinely new, that nobody else knew about, at least certainly not in Germany at that time, and that probably would change the way the field would perceive China. And I was interested in archaeology. I had taken a class in classical archaeology as part of this sort of general education at Bonn University. I sort of thought I knew what archaeology was like, but frankly, when I went to China to study archaeology, it was more like a way of getting into Chinese civilization in a more profound way. I also thought that as an archaeologist, one would always have a good excuse to travel wherever one wanted and look at the local monument. It would also teach one not just, you know, what was then still a mainly Marxist, Maoist vocabulary that, of analysis that was rather stultifying, in my opinion, but a more concrete way of dealing with actual evidence to describe things. So it would be a good way of learning Chinese. I didn't really expect when I started out learning about Chinese archaeology in Peking University, that would be what I would spend the rest of my life there. There was no realistic way of imagining such a thing, because there certainly weren't any jobs, and in any case, in the back of my mind was still sort of this vague idea of becoming some kind of China expert, in maybe even sort of in the public service, maybe, you know, as a diplomat. There were all kinds of things one could do with Chinese. My grandfather, you mentioned that in what you wrote to me, and indeed my grandfather, who when the family was sort of, well, they always knew that I would do something strange, but they were of course a little worried when I started with Chinese in university. But my grandfather at the time said, this is absolutely the thing to do. China is the future. And that when he was in university shortly after World War I, he had been advised by somebody in his family that was what he should do. But, you know, it being shortly after World War I and there being a major crisis in the country, he hadn't felt able to do that. So, there was a sense that China was tremendously important, understudied, going to be more important, and whatever one did about China would be a way of making a decent living, even if it weren't as a Chinese archaeology professor. But then, of course, one thing came to the other. I met students of Casey Zhang, who then became my advisor as well. I sort of got it into my head that I wanted to study with Casey as well. Casey himself at first was understandably a little skeptical, but eventually accepted that. And so the rest is history. It's sort of a concatenation of accidents that got me into this field. But of course, the more you do it, the more interesting it becomes. So it's once you start, it's very hard to stop.
That's right. let's talk a little bit more about like your experiences when you first did go to China, because that's before we maybe talk a little bit more about the time when you were studying with Casey Zhang and other people in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about your first like memories? Like, what were the experiences like when you first arrived in China? How did you meet the people that you were in a cohort with of other international students, and then the classmates that you had within Beida, within Peking University? And so I'd love to hear just about your interactions with those people, and also with the faculty who were in the university at the time.
Yeah, that's all very complex. You know, we were sent as a group by the German Academic Exchange Service. We all met over a weekend before we left. There was sort of an orientation meeting. I think none of us had, oh yeah, maybe one or two had been on China on one of these organized trips that you could take during the Cultural Revolution. But for me, it was certainly my first trip, not just to China, but to anywhere in Asia. I'd been to the United States, but not to, certainly not to anywhere in the Eastern world. And on the way to Beijing, we had to take Lufthansa as far as Lufthansa would go. And at that time, there were no Lufthansa flights. So we were to China. So we were sent to Mumbai. And from Bombay, we had to take whatever was cheapest, which was Ethiopian Airlines, which had a direct flight out of Addis Ababa that connected through Mumbai. So we were on that flight, and we spent about maybe a few hours in India, in Bombay, where of course I had not been either. And where, in fact, I wasn't going to go back until 2007 was the next time I've ever traveled there. But it was enough to experience some of the chaos and the unbelievable sort of disorder, and of course very lively, but also rather frightening for somebody who came from Western Europe at the time, that India has to offer. Then we landed at Beijing Airport, which at that time was tiny. And everything was quiet and very orderly. And you could already see that from the plane. I mean, the contrast couldn't have been bigger. And then we were, of course, brought to what is now Chinese Culture University. It was then the Language Institute, where we were screened for our language competency. I spent there about a month. Yeah, that's where we met our first Chinese fellow students. We certainly hadn't had any in Germany, at least I didn't know. I think I knew one or two Taiwanese people, but certainly nobody from the mainland. And the amount of contacts we were able to have were somewhat limited. It was strictly regimented at the time. And so it was a slow process. Of course, part of it was that at the time, my Chinese wasn't exactly excellent. And I myself tended to be rather shy. And so much of this time, we didn't really interact with our Chinese fellow student. That came sort of gradually in the course of time. And then when I finally made it to Peking University after a few weeks at the Language Institute, I had a Chinese roommate who was a wonderful fellow, but he has since passed away. So I can't anymore compare our recollections, but I must have been the most enigmatic thing and also the most challenging thing that he had ever experienced. And I am not sure that we had an extremely cordial relationship. I mean, we tried to understand one another. I'm not sure I understood him very well. He was much older than I was. Everybody in China who was in university at the time was older, and many people were 10 years or more older than I was. They had all gone through the Cultural Revolution. He was from a small village in Shanxi and had been a peasant all his life, and somehow made it into Beida's archaeology program. Unbelievable, you know, the kind of resilience and also intelligence that must have been there is something that I only now realize. You know, what a remarkable person he must have been. But at the time, I didn't quite realize that to the full extent. And then this roommate of mine decided that he couldn't stand it. He didn't blame me, although he probably should have. It was probably all my fault. But he thought that this was we were incompatible, and he went back to the Chinese students' dorm where they were living, you know, 10 or 8 to 10 people in a small room, whereas in the foreign students' dormitories was the same kind of room, but with only 2 people in them. So he took, I mean, great hardship. And at that point, the head of the archaeology section at Peking University decided that there was no use pairing me up with a Chinese undergraduate. So he arranged for one of his graduate students to become my roommate. And this fellow, who is still a professor, well, now retired at Peking University, was 20 years older than I am, basically my parents' generation. And he had a plan of going to Germany and study there the collections that had been looted from Xinjiang by the German expeditions before World War I. And so he had a strong motivation of living together with a German student. And in fact, that worked out extremely well. We did communicate at many levels, but especially about this, about archaeology, and didn't speak much German to each other. I think I learned much more English, much more Chinese from him than he learned German from me. But I did sometimes help him a little bit with the kinds of things that he needed to read, the German publications about the Buddhist cave temples, and eventually he did succeed. So when I left China, he also went to Germany as a Humboldt fellow. So very nice arrangement. Spent 2 years there, learned German perfectly, and became one of the major experts. Well, he probably already was, because he had done a great deal of work in the field there as well, but was really able to deal with this material, had seen whatever was still there. Some of it had been destroyed during the war. But anyway, so that was very beneficial in a mutual sense. It also, of course, then got me in some way more close to the Chinese faculty, because they didn't interact with the undergraduates on the kind of intensive basis that they did with the graduate students. I mean, Professor Subai would sometimes show up in our room to discuss things with my roommate. Unusual, I mean, to think about this now, but they did that. The other professors I also knew. I became quite close in some ways, but much of this was later, to Professor Yue Chao, who was a wonderfully congenial intellectual, not merely an archaeologist, although he was also, of course, a first-rate archaeologist, but just a man of culture, deeply interested in literature, music, other things that, of course, when you are interested in those, it also helps you in being a better archaeologist. So it all sort of came together. He later left Peking University and became the director of what is now the National Museum of China, then the Museum of Chinese History, and had a very positive impact there. But, and of course, I also learned a great deal from Professor Zhou Hong, who was this amazing specialist on the Bronze Age, which ended up being my special field. At first, I thought I would do the Han period because I was so fascinated with Professor Yu's classes, but I realized that if I wanted to do archaeology in the proper way, I couldn't be a Han specialist because I would have to spend too much time getting on top of the written record. Mm-hmm. Whereas I was interested, of course, and still am, in the written sources and in inscriptions and all this material. But in the Han field, that almost by necessity takes over, or anyway, it takes over a great deal of the time, the limited time you have in preparing yourself. So later when I was at Harvard, my fellow student Wu Hong, who came from China and had classical background, he was able to become a Han specialist. But as a Westerner, that wasn't realistic, in my opinion, at least not the way things looked for me at the time. So in the end, the Bronze Age seemed just right. There were some texts. There was also, of course, then the challenge of having to learn the epigraphic materials, which was something I hadn't really sort of considered before, but I've since become extremely interested in, and so it was what I then ended up doing. So in that sense, I became also a very direct student of Professor Zhou Hong. And both of these Peking University professors, Professor Zhou and Professor Yu, later were invited to Harvard. And so I had the very good fortune to study with them again at that time, while I was also studying with Casey Zhang. That was serendipitous, but it of course worked out extremely well in that way. I shouldn't neglect the other luminaries from whom I took classes at Peking University. There was also, of course, for the Neolithic period, Professor Yan Wenming, the only one who is still alive now. He's going to have his 90th birthday. Oh, and I owe him an article for his Festschrift. Hopefully I'll finish it before the deadline. But of course, that too was extremely inspiring and fitted very well. I mean, the approach of to archaeology in this generation was not the same, but somehow it was cohesive. So that whatever we learned about the Neolithic somehow fed in what we learned about the later period, without being determined by a historiographical approach, the way some people approach the Neolithic. That's not at all Professor Yen's thing. But he was able to present the material in a way that was, first of all, extremely lucid, which it by itself is a tremendous challenge, considering how complicated the Chinese Neolithic is, but also in a way that sort of made it seem relevant to understanding what happened later. And of course, we have learned a great deal more since then, which in the 1980s we simply couldn't have known, lacking the evidence, which makes this more complicated in an interesting way. But certainly this was a very good background to get. We also had Professor Lü Zunhe, who was at that time the major specialist in Paleolithic archaeology. Since I wasn't sort of inclined towards the natural science, never had been, that was never a main focus for me. Very different, by the way, from Casey Zhang, who started out wanting to do that. But of course, I took that class as well and learned a great deal from it. And then there were some of the younger people who weren't giving their own classes yet, but sometimes were allowed to teach, one class within one of the courses taught by their elder colleagues. So one of them was Professor Li Botian, who is also still alive and has since become the chair of the department and a very prominent Chinese archaeologist. But at that time, he was still very much at the beginning of his career. There were also several others, like Professor Li Yangsong, who has now passed away. We had Professor Gao Ming for epigraphy, and that was also, I think, a very good match to what the rest that was offered. Somehow it all cohered. Professor Gao's approach to the epigraphic material was essentially an archaeological one, unlike the approaches taken in the Chinese department, where of course epigraphy was also taught by the then and since much more famous Professor Chu Xigui, who had a more, well, we thought at the time it was a more linguistic approach, but we have now learned, I mean, I've become rather critical of that. It wasn't linguistic enough. It was sort of halfway in between traditional paleography and a more linguistically informed method, but not really there, and without the archaeological dimension. So I was better off studying with Professor Gao, and I'm now quite convinced of that. At the time, I wanted to get in Professor Chu's classes, but he wouldn't let any people from outside the Chinese literature department in there. I snuck in there a few times, sort of as an auditor, but never became a follower in that sense. I'm not meaning to denigrate Professor Chu's contribution. He has made very major contribution. But for an archaeologist trying to integrate this kind of material into their range of competency, Professor Gao's approach was just right.
So with all these faculty with whom you were interacting and the students there, were they the vector through which you came to know Zhang Guanzhi, or was that through reading the English literature that he was the primary author of much of? Or, I mean, what was the avenue of your connection? You mentioned already that your first interactions with him were he had a little bit of a skeptical perspective, perhaps, but that passed. But how did that come about? Like, where did that come from?
Right. Well, the foreign archaeology students who were at that point, during my second year, we were 10. I think during the first year there were fewer, from all kinds of places, Canada, Great Britain, Italy, and of course, Japan. That was the largest group, and also by far the most well prepared. And then there were successively three American students, but one of them was sort of off on his own, and we've really never heard from him again. The other two were both students of Casey Zhang. And I had heard of Casey Zhang before, because in my introduction to Sinology seminar at Bonn University, archaeology was introduced for a few minutes and said, and we were told, yes, there are two books one can read about archaeology. There is Zheng de Kun, and that's 4 volumes, and therefore obviously the much better book. And then there is Casey Zhang, who only was able to write 1 volume, The Archaeology of Ancient China. So before I left for China, I actually read through all 4 volumes of Zheng de Kun, which was killingly boring. And I thought, well, it better be more interesting than that. But of course, informative in some way. And my father, who had to take a business trip to the United States at the time, at my request, brought me back a copy of Casey Zhang's Archaeology of Ancient China, not the 3rd edition, which had then been published already, but for some reason he only was able to find the 2nd edition. Anyway, that I took with me to China and read there. And the more I sort of read that alongside what I was experiencing in class, the more I realized what an extraordinary achievement that was. Mm-hmm. And then the students whom I ran into had nothing but good to say about Casey Zhang. I mean, to them, and they were very different. One was a white American guy from Yale, who has since done wonderful service to the field. He was one of the first to try to typeset Chinese on a computer when that was still extremely difficult. So he had he had his own business doing that. Maybe still has it, and during a time when that became important, he was the sinological typesetter to the American scholarly community. Never, unfortunately, finished his dissertation. Very sad, because I once read 1 chapter of it that he had written, which was very brilliant. And the other one was somebody of a Chinese American who was from Harvard and who then for a while worked at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, but left the field, unfortunately. But those 2 were, at the time, people I looked up to very much. They had very good training with Casey Zhang. That was clear, and as I said, they were raving about their advisor, which I mean, I didn't know much about graduate school at the time, but somehow I had already sort of the sense that most people will not talk well about their advisors. Most people, and this turned out to be rather true when I was at Harvard. Most of my fellow students that I knew had a terrible either fear of their advisors, or they had become alienated and tried to avoid them. And but here was somebody who was genuinely loved by his own students. So I thought he must be rather unusual. And so, as the months went on, I thought, well, why don't I apply to see whether I can get in? Then I applied to an MA program in regional studies at Casey. I actually wrote to Casey Zhang at the time, and he suggested that. He didn't want to take the risk, what if I were sort of a charlatan? And so try it out for a year and see whether you like it. In fact, when I then first met him in Beijing, on one of the trips he took, he said Harvard was a pressure cook pot. It's not for everybody. He probably thought that I might be sort of a will of the wisp who was just sort of superficially interested in Chinese archaeology, but really didn't want to pursue it. And he was right in suspecting that, because I had come into it in this rather serendipitous way that I described. So it was good advice. It's just an example of how Casey Zhang somehow intuitively was able to sense what probably would be right for each individual student. He probably wouldn't have necessarily given this advice to somebody else. I mean, if I had been like Ken Sasaki, for example, who knew probably from the day he was born that he was going to be an archaeologist, he would have probably taken me into the archaeology department, in the anthropology department right away, without, you know, subjecting me to some kind of a trial period like that. But I wasn't like that. And he also realized that this wasn't necessarily a disadvantage, because one of the other things I remember him saying during this first meeting we had at a hotel in Beijing, which no longer exists, but where he was staying near the Institute of Archaeology, was that, you know, as an archaeologist, you have to be tâche. You have to know many different things. You don't need to know them very well, but you have to be aware of them. And of course, that was true of him. So that was, in a sense, a validation of the person I probably was at the time. And I've always felt sort of encouraged to persist in my eclectic and sometimes incoherent intellectual and aesthetic interests that I had alongside with archaeology, Chinese archaeology. In that sense, it was okay to be like that.
I want to hear more about how the way in which you experienced yourself and witnessed his really amazingly adept and sensitive mentorship has influenced the way in which you have mentored another generation of both students and colleagues. But before that, I actually have a question that came up as you mentioned that you received the second edition of his book, or the year when the third edition was published, and then you know, joined him as a student in the process of the transformation of that work from this third edition to the fourth, which is this major reorientation of his thinking about how to synthesize the field. And so, could you tell us to what extent you were a witness to him rethinking his perception of how it all fit together, that then emerges in this fourth edition as he kind of reorients his approach to prehistory to be one much more kind of multi-centric and multifaceted?
Yeah, you know, I didn't witness. He was working in his office on that, and we didn't really know what he was going to do. We, of course, knew that there were huge numbers of new discoveries, that he would have to work into that, but that it would be a whole new vision of the field was something that one could only see once the book was out. And he gave me the galleys to read in preparation for my generals. And I read them very carefully, and I found, you know, hundreds and hundreds of typos. I remember only that. And so I went back to Casey Young with the galleys and said, listen, you know, you have to take this back to the publisher. There are too many typos. And frankly, I probably, during that first reading, I didn't get what a monumental achievement this was. And that sort of came later. On the other hand, the way that he then looked at Chinese archaeology in the 1986, well, in the edition that finally came out in 1986, which I must have read in 1984, that vision was sort of closer to what I had already experienced at Beida. So in that sense, it wasn't so new to me. It probably was newer to his older students.
That actually comment is really interesting as well, because in the perception that I think is kind of in the sort of general picture of the way in which Chinese prehistory is presented, even within China, I mean, Su Bingqi often comes up as this monumentally important figure in the synthesis of that era for a similar type of reorientation. And yet, in the late 70s and early 80s, there's already a semblance, as you're saying, in Beida, in the way in which prehistory is being taught that fits with that perspective, and that Chang synthesizes as well. Is that right?
Well, it also fits the data,
Right.
the data the way we saw them at the time. It fits, of course, the sort of a more or less traditional, historiographically informed approach to Chinese archaeology, but it also fits the way the data seem to present themselves in each region in the 1980s. And people like Professor Yen and Professor Yu, who were both, by the way, very loyal students of Su Bingqi, were developing this kind of an approach. It wasn't just Professor Su. Professor Su wrote a couple of articles that sort of synthesized that, but I think Professor Su sort of became a kind of rallying figure for a whole group of students of the generations below him who wanted to do things different from the way the Chinese, the Institute of Archaeology of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences was doing it under Xianai. And they needed somebody preferably even a little older than Xianai. I think Su Bingqi was a year older than Xianai, to sort of latch or to hitch this idea onto. But frankly, it wasn't Professor Su himself necessarily who is single-mindedly sort of this genius who figured this out. That would be giving him too much credit. When I was at Beida during those 2 years, Su Bingqi was still officially the head of the archaeology section there. It hadn't separated off from the history department at the time yet. It hadn't become its own department, which happened only in 1983. But he showed up only once during those 2 years and gave us a terribly long lecture, which was the most boring thing I've ever heard. It was and was mainly basically how to be a good archaeologist by, listening to the party and always doing what the regulations say, things like that. But on and on for 2 hours, nothing archaeological in there that I can remember. And I thought, oh my God. But so he then retired, and I met him again in person years later, and I came to realize that that wasn't at all what he was like. I mean, I don't know why he thought he had to give a lecture like that. But he was much more interesting, and he would talk about his experience as a student. I actually once interviewed him. I had been commissioned to write his vita for a collective volume of lives of eminent archaeologists, and he, for some reason, was in there, and so he was still alive at the time. I went to his apartment and talked to him for half a day about his experiences in early life. Very interesting. And clearly, I mean, he was also somebody who had a remarkable outlook on the field. But as an intellect, he was no match to Xianai. Not only no match, I mean, he差得很远. And I think people at the time realized that, in spite of lionizing him in this manner. And when I wrote those two, I had been commissioned to write 2 archaeologists, Xianai and Su Bingqi. Somehow, Casey Zhang in the same volume wrote about his teacher Li Ji, and then I got to write about those 2. And of course, I tried to sort of balance them off. Balance the coverage, and I just somehow couldn't find a way of writing the same amount of stuff about both of them without writing an overly detailed biography of Su Bingqi while giving a very much abridged version of Xianai. So in the end, I decided simply to do justice to as much justice as the format would allow to Xianai and write about his achievements at some detail. And that meant that the Su Bingqi coverage became much shorter. That article is, I think, at most half the length of the Xianai article. And that's not because I didn't know enough about Su Bingqi, but because I think the subject matter required it in this way. Again, I'm in no mind of denigrating Professor Su. He's very remarkable and also an extraordinarily nice person. Xianai was an extremely remarkable person, but certainly not a nice person, and didn't want to be. That wasn't his aim in life. But as a scholar and also as an academic institution builder, of course, the achievements of Xianai are not to be sneezed at, and compared to those, Professor Su sort of pales. And whatever Professor Su is credited with in sort of reconceptualizing the intellectual framework of Chinese archaeology wasn't Professor Su's own achievement or sole achievement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does point to the way in which he may, and maybe you can comment on this, but I might suspect he was the sort of advisor that facilitated students like Reorienting and Yue Chao to become as influential as they were. And that kind of feeding back of his students lionizing him may reflect on some of the degree to which he was a great mentor, as many others. I mean, we've talked about Casey already. I mean, I count you as a fantastic mentor of both of myself and many of the students who have worked with you. Could you say a little bit more about the way in which you either very consciously or even subconsciously have found yourself approaching the process of mentoring students who are under kind of direct advising of yourself, but also those in the field with whom you've interacted over the past couple of decades?
Yeah, that's of course a mixed story. You know, I don't think any one teacher can be successful with 100% of people who come and approach him or her. And I saw that with Casey Zhang too. Casey Zhang did not only have successes in his relationship with his students. There were a couple of cases that I'm aware of, but where it simply didn't work. Mm-hmm. Where he then sort of found a way of weaning them and maybe when that was possible, letting them study with somebody else. And I found myself in that situation too, as you know. Not very often, thank God, but often enough that it has made me quite aware of my limitations in the mentoring arena. So of course it takes two in every such relationship. And once it happens at the doctoral level, it becomes very individualized. It's no longer sort of a cohort of people who, at least not in my experience. Of course, this may be different with people who have larger numbers of students. But in my case, it certainly has been very much one-on-one. You've experienced it. Everybody else has experienced it. Sometimes, well, most cases that I remember, I think we've tried to get the best out of what was possible given the constellation. I mean, it's of course the most important thing is the student, him or herself, but then also, you know, what UCLA can offer, which isn't, you know, everything. It's a limited range of things. We can try to enhance it thanks to our Luz Foundation grant. We've been able to give support to quite a number of our students to work in China. And then there are also other opportunities which people can have. Even more importantly, we've been able to hire Professor Li Min, who has done very well at UCLA, and who is sort of a counterweight of some of the things that I do. That has worked very well. And for my art history colleague, Professor Li Huishu, with whom I work very well as a team as well. So at UCLA, perhaps to an even greater extent than at other institutions, it's the training part, I mean, the faculty role in the training is a team effort. It's not, you know, I very strongly discourage all my students and all the students in our respective departments to run around and identify them as students of so-and-so. That is, you know, academic feudalism, which runs against my own personal inclinations, but also is simply not compatible with life in the 21st century, if it ever was before. So yes, I'm of course extremely fortunate and also proud of having been a student of Professor Casey Zhang, but I am not, you know, that's not the first thing that I'm telling people about myself when I when I try to tell them who I am. And I hope that my students do this as well, that they talk about Chinese archaeology or whatever archaeology they do, or art history or whatever, and that they mention UCLA before they mention me, or anybody else they might have studied there. And I think, I mean, certainly at UCLA, and I think that's probably true at Harvard and other institutions as well, it is the conjuncture of faculty talent who work well together that has enabled whatever successes we've been able to have. And I guess, yes, I mean, if you ask me about my principles in mentorship, that's one of the principles, you know, making sure that there's a good understanding among the various faculty involved, that we all are on the same place as far as a particular student is concerned, and that we give the student the opportunities that we can and that the student needs.
And I think that you've highlighted there what a really important thing, both, and that has to do with kind of collective interactions that make for exciting exciting scholarship and real impacts, both in terms of the way in which mentors work as a group to effectively train and support people who are earlier in their careers, and also the way in which the experience that one might have as a faculty member within a department or as a student in a cohort of graduate students may be so influential. I mean, it may be, I think it's the case that more often than not at UCLA, and this is also true at Harvard, we don't have big cohorts of students who are working on very similar issues. But I was very fortunate to be in the same year as Chen Bojen and also taking classes the same year as Yewei, even though she started the year after us. And so we did end up having this very fortuitous cohort of students that, I mean, I couldn't have done anything that I was able to do without. And I think that that's true, even if you don't have students who are working on very similar topics. When you have a cohort of students who are interacting in ways that are intellectually stimulating, that becomes super impactful. Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree, and this has become more difficult over the years as we've been forced to reduce the number of students that we can take in. But we are still trying to create these situations, and that's of course totally serendipitous. It also, of course, requires the students to make a certain effort to get along with one another, and this is not something a professor can legislate. This just has to happen. So in your case and with Chen Bojen, it worked fantastically.
Yeah. And you know, a testament to people like him who have a personality that is just
Yes, but you can't legislate people's personalities. So, there again, you have to make sure that at least they won't clash with others. But I've been fortunate, I've had almost exclusively students who have been extremely socially able and willing to interact generously with their fellow students, and so there's nothing I need to do there. They will do the right thing by themselves, and you have to sort of rely that some of this is going to happen. Otherwise, the pedagogical effort cannot take place. Certainly not in a classroom situation.
I don't think you give yourself quite enough credit, Lothar, because I think that you do, to some extent, model the way in which one can be generous with other people.
Well, I mean, I am fortunate in that I have a lot to share, but I would be foolish not to share it, because what would I do with it all by myself? So in that sense, I'm only doing what is best for everybody and what is most agreeable to myself. I'm not sort of, making sacrifices or anything like that.
Sure. I would love to find a way to continue this conversation to get to some of the questions about the directions of going. I think we should probably maybe stop and see if there's a way we can do this in two settings.
Yes. Yes, there's limited time. So let's reschedule ourselves for another hour some other time.
Yeah.
We clearly haven't progressed. I'm being too discursive. I'm sorry.
No, actually, this is fantastic. I mean, even if we ended up stopping here, I'm sure this would be what Madalena was looking for, because all the types of background that you've been able to provide about this is really cool.